France had said that they would welcome, France was supposed to welcome these Spanish refugees, and yet it was. Same thing with the hospital. You really don't need to tie down the patients to their beds and treat them like animals, and yet this was happening. So what was this the case, and how could we prevent this? One of the main hypotheses of institutional psychotherapy was that alienation was always psychic and social at once. This is what Tosquelles called the theory of double alienation. So it was always like, you cannot think alienation just politically or socially, and you cannot think it just purely psychically. You have to think about the intersections of these two forms of alienation. And this really works well with the French term alienation, which refers to kind of the psychic state of being mad or insane, but it's also a social condition that makes people feel estranged, trapped, or isolated from others. So this is why Tosquelles referred to Marx and Freud as the two legs of institutional psychotherapy. It wasn't Marx or Freud, it was Marx with Freud. And the two legs, the idea was that when one walked, the other had to follow, right? So that's why two legs went hand in hand. So this question, in some ways, best captured the project of institutional psychotherapy. Could psychiatry imagine, within the limited confines of the hospital, a philosophy, a social theory, and a clinical practice that would prevent the chronic reappearance of these political and psychic concentrationisms? So how can we imagine institutions that could be constantly rethought, reworked, and remapped? So this is all kind of abstract, but let me show you, in the time I have left, some images and some examples of the kinds of activities that the doctors set up to organize the patient's daily experience. Because if it was, I made it sound that this was more like an idea, a kind of philosophically driven movement, but it was also very much anchored in the praxis. Like, the idea was that you could not dissociate praxis and ideas or philosophy in some ways, that they were constantly informing one another and informed by one another. So to disalienate the patients, the hospital, and the psychiatric profession, but also the community at large, the first step was at the level of architecture. It consisted in demolishing the walls around the asylum. So you see all of the walls here that separated the asylum from the village. Right after the war, they basically took hammers and tore those down so that the patients could walk around the village and the villagers could come into the hospital. There wasn't this kind of physical barrier. Same thing with the cells. This is what the dorm, this is where everybody slept in one big room, basically. So you no longer had patients tied to their beds in individual cells. Similarly, you eliminated uniforms and medical blouses, so you could no longer, and the idea here was that you could no longer tell who was a doctor, a nurse, or a patient. And what this did is it forced you to, what they said, explode fixed roles, right? So you didn't get too comfortable in your position as a doctor or too comfortable in your position as a nurse. But it also forced you to consider the singularity of each patient's illness. Each patient who entered the hospital was welcomed by a committee composed of doctors, nurses, and patients that would orient him or her around the castle, and in some ways explain the logistics of the treatment and of daily life. So this is a brochure from the 1970s where you see there's a map of the hospital right here, explaining what the activities are, what the patients can do, the kind of organization of the day, etc. If the hospital was to function as what they called a healing collective, then it needed to develop structures to produce or institute a new social. One of the most important innovations was what they called the club. The club, the best way to think of this is as a kind of patient-run cooperative, like a kind of union, if you'd like, so composed of the patients that was in charge of organizing all activities within the hospital. The club planned the meals, theater and music performances, sports, parties, and field trips, social activities that were deemed integral to the cure. So this is some posters also of the kinds of activities that they were organizing in the hospital. You see it's like a theater, plays in which the patients would act, Afro, jazz, Occitan. But really there's many of them. This is an example of ergotherapy stations, so where people did pottery, painting, woodwork. They also had a library. I should say also in parenthesis that some of the artwork that was produced in the hospital ended up making its way into museums and galleries under the label of art brut, or in English, sometimes it's known as outsider art. So art that was kind of produced outside of the confines of the official art world. This is one example of a patient, Auguste Forestier, who's a psychotic patient who was at Saint-Alban for all his life, whose sculptures are currently housed at the collection of art brut in Switzerland. The collection that was, so you see, this is the kinds of stuff he did, like wood carving. This is Tosquelles holding one of his boats. The person responsible in some ways for popularizing some of this is the artist Jean Dubuffet, who traveled to Saint-Alban and wanted to meet some of the patients and brought some of this stuff back to his collection that was in Paris and New York and eventually ended up in Switzerland. There's actually an exhibit that's going to happen in 2023 that is going to be opening at the American Folk Art Museum that will be talking about some of this stuff. So keep your eyes open for that in a few years. I think it's going to be exciting. It talks about institutional psychotherapy and art brut, and it's currently in Toulouse and it's going to go to Barcelona, Madrid, and eventually to New York. So, okay, so that's this. This is another important thing that the club organized. It's a journal called Trait d'Union. It was a weekly journal and basically a collection of texts. So some were more theoretical, some were more literary, poetic, drawings, but also recipes, advertisement, and letters. I put these two because you'll see that this one has an editorial by Tosquelles and this one by Fanon, who I'll talk about in a second. And the idea, again, when they talk about the journal, was that it was both informational, like it told you what was going on in the hospital, but also it had a practical goal because by reading and writing, you kind of took yourself outside of your own bubble and necessarily you ended up being kind of connected to the broader world. And this is, of course, all very close in spirit to the POUM, right? To all of these activities. This is why I was talking about the POUM, a kind of self-managed, radically democratic and anti-authoritarian vision of the social. The idea was to constantly avoid getting too comfortable, too settled in your own ego, in your own identity, or in your own theoretical certainties. One last example, because I think this is probably my favorite from Laborde, so another clinic that practiced institutional psychotherapy. It's a double, so it's called La Grille, the grid, and it's a double entry chart. So you see here that there's a timetable and the name of all the staff people, basically, but the doctors, also the nurses, and the work that's assigned to him or her. And what would happen is that every day the names would rotate. So you would never get too comfortable in a particular job, right? Whether you are doing the insulin treatments or the infirmary or the drawing, right? And you could constantly you wouldn't be the person doing that because you would always forced to rethink your own position. And Guattari, who wrote a lot about the grid, said that it was an instrument of disorganization to avoid the passivity generated by bureaucratic routine. And the grid also presented a forum through which staff members could discuss their feelings, their desires, their fears by talking and questioning incessantly all activities and all relationships. So I wanted to show you one 1 minute clip of this, and this is the grid actually at Laborde, when I visited it a few years ago. So you see that they still use this idea. I want to show you a tiny clip of this film by Martine Ders, which is coming out. It's going to be distributed very soon, but it's kind of amazing. She found the reels from the patients at Saint-Alban, so you get a sense of what the hospital looked like. She also did a very good movie on Oury. So here I'll show you. It's just it's the trailer. It's just. This is what the hospital looks like. This is the club.
I especially like this film. I mean, this moment because it's also like so French that the thing that they have to have a committee about is to go on vacation and organize this as a group. But even the patients need obviously to go on vacation. It's really a fantastic film. I was just telling Lauren and Matthew that I hope we can. She's trying to bring it to the U.S. now, so I hope we can find a forum, even maybe at Columbia, to show it because it's. She found these amazing reels of life in the hospital. Okay, last section quickly. What is the legacy, or was the legacy, or what can be the legacy of institutional psychotherapy? Oops. From the beginning, institutional psychotherapy had many followers. And so each chapter of my book is devoted to one of these figures who worked with institutional psychotherapy and who followed its development. So I mentioned Tosquelles already, but some of the other names of scholars or doctors who were involved with institutional psychotherapy include Frantz Fanon, who was a medical resident at Saint-Alban in 1952 and 1953, after he completed medical school in Lyon. When he arrived at the hospital, Fanon was already the author of several important works, including this essay called The North African Syndrome, and the book Black Skins, White Masks, the famous book. The kinds of experiments that Tosquelles and his colleagues had set up at Saint-Alban and the results they were getting confirmed many of the philosophical hypotheses that Fanon had put forth in his early work on race and racism. In particular, Fanon had argued that the psyche and the social were structurally linked, that colonialism and racism had crucial psychological effects, and that psychiatry could and should be political. I mean, Fanon's work has obviously had a kind of renaissance right now with all of the kind of attention to the psychological effects of race in the last couple of years. He had this one famous quote that I love, that all political leaders needed to be psychiatrists. So really thinking about the intersections of psyche and politics. At Saint-Alban, Tosquelles had a profound influence on Fanon, and Fanon brought the insights of institutional psychotherapy to North Africa, first at the psychiatric hospital of Blida-Joinville in Algeria. So this is where he sort of wrote a lot of his medical texts and where he spent a lot of his life from 53 to 57, and later in the day center in Tunisia, where he lived until his death in 1961. Throughout those years, Fanon worked with psychotic patients and wrote about institutional psychotherapy, about its benefits and its limits in a colonial context. At the same time, he got increasingly involved with the Front de Libération Nationale, with anti-colonial activism more generally, and wrote some of his most important political texts, including The Wretched of the Earth. So here he is, you see him here with his medical team in Blida. What's interesting, so this is his psychiatric writings that have been published and translated in English in this fantastic collection, edited by Jean Calfa and Robert Young. I really recommend this. I mean, it's just great what they did. But if you read the psychiatric text in parallel to Wretched of the Earth, you see how institutional psychotherapy was literally intertwined from a theoretical standpoint, but also at the very concrete level of production with Fanon's political works. I mean, he wrote his political works in the morning. I think he dictated to the secretary from 7 to 9, and then he worked with patients all day. So it's kind of hard, you really can't dissociate the two. Another early advocate of institutional psychotherapy was Jean Oury, who was a resident at Saint-Alban in 1947, and then who in 1953 founded the clinic of Laborde in Courcheverny. Throughout the 1960s, Laborde became a sort of mythical pilgrimage site for the French intellectual world, as it welcomed philosophers, artists, writers, filmmakers, in addition to the medical personnel. And you know, Matthew and Lauren and I have been talking about translating some of these, or editing at least some of this, the Oury text, because they're really interesting. And he's perhaps the one who thought most about the phenomenology of psychosis and its possible treatments, who kind of wrote more systematically about this, because some of the others were more practitioners but had less writing. Laborde also provided a home for the philosopher, psychoanalyst, and political activist Felix Guattari, who worked at the clinic from 1955 until he died in 1992. Oury, Guattari, and their colleagues at Laborde borrowed and adapted many of the Saint-Alban techniques to reorganize the life of the clinic and to imagine new vectors of transference for what they called the psychotic unconscious. Their clinical practice also evolved alongside Lacanian psychoanalysis, and many of the doctors of Laborde attended Lacan's seminars in Paris each week. So they kind of all took the train, I think it was Wednesdays, had their own analysis, analytic sessions, went to the seminar, and now came back in the train. For Guattari, the type of psychiatry performed at Laborde was in perfect continuity with his political and philosophical activity. All of these provided different terrains to think through the role of institutions, and as a social and subjective anchor, and to envision radically horizontal, anti-authoritarian, and deterritorialized spaces. This is the term he used. Most famously, perhaps, Guattari explored the intersections of the psychiatric and the philosophical in his magnum opus, co-written with Gilles Deleuze, Anti-Oedipus, published in 1972. One of the guiding hypotheses of Anti-Oedipus was that alienation was always social and psychic at once, a lesson that Guattari and Oury had learned from Tosquelles. Oedipalization, this is the concept that they put forth, that they invent in some ways, described the entrapment of desire and its channeling into the safe route of the heterosexual family. And so Oedipalization for them was not just a kind of a social condition, but was also a state of being, right? A form of psychic renunciation to the plenitude of desire. So this is, I think, it's interesting to think about Anti-Oedipus in relation to Foucault's preface to the book. Foucault wrote a really interesting preface to Anti-Oedipus, where so I'll just read this a little bit. He says, I would say that Anti-Oedipus is a book of ethics, the first book of ethics to be written in France in quite a long time. Being anti-Oedipal has become a lifestyle, a way of thinking and living, right? So this makes sense, this idea of like, how could you constantly question your own egos, your own certainties? How does one keep from being fascist, especially when one believes oneself to be a revolutionary militant? How do we rid our speech and our acts, our hearts and our pleasures of fascism? How do we ferret out the fascism that is ingrained in our behavior? So I think this gives us a good transition to return to my initial question, why should we care about institutional psychotherapy today? This is more of a political answer, but I'm curious to hear if you have a more, if you think we should still care about this clinically, but politically, I think many of the psychoanalytic notions put forth by institutional psychotherapy can still be helpful today, especially, in light of this quote, right? Not just to understand fascism in its historical manifestations, so not just the Hitler and the Mussolinis and the Francos, even though those were extremely important to the birth of institutional psychotherapy, as I've tried to show here, but to understand these fascisms in our heads, right? The fascisms that Foucault says cause us to love power, to desire the thing that dominates us and exploits us. So I showed you, this picture at the beginning, but in some ways I could have shown you also this one. Trump was a kind of constant presence that I was writing this book. And I was struck by the fact that so much kind of contemporary scholarship that was trying to make sense of Trumpism was sort of still stuck in these alternatives between a kind of liberal model and a kind of vulgar Marxist model. So the liberal model that saw fascism and Trumpism as a kind of political pathology, as a failure of rationality, as an anomaly in an otherwise seamless historical trajectory. And on the other hand, you had the kind of vulgar Marxist diagnoses that read this as a mere displacement of a social or economic reality, right? That it was all about the economy, the poor white working classes, right? But neither of these analyses could take into account the very desire that motivates the crowds. So not just negative desire, but positive desire, the kind of jouissance that you see in this picture, right? To use a Lacanian term, the jouissance for authoritarianism, for racism, misogyny, and also the identificatory power that a figure like Donald Trump was able to mobilize, or the ways in which all kinds of fantasies that are not true still have very real and concrete political effects. So in this sense, I think institutional psychotherapy might have something, I'm going to put this picture instead of leaving Trump, might have something useful to add to by foregrounding the role of the unconscious in all group formations, but also the collective dimension of all subjective development. So, right, it's always two things at once. Like the subject is always social, but the social is also always unconscious, or impacted by the unconscious. The unconscious for them was not simply an add-on or a supplement to the social theory, but rather the basis of the transferential process, the vector through which individuals and collectives could explore fantasies, conflicts, and desires. Ultimately, the unconscious was the means by which the group could avoid closing on itself. The radical reorganization of the asylum sought to disalienate alienation, but never once and for all. So their goal was really to produce the social or produce a collectivity, but that meant that you had to produce its conditions of possibility, to work through the effects of transference, of counter-transference, resistances, and power with constant vigilance. Or as Oury put it, this is a great quote from Oury in French, and it doesn't really work in English, but it's ne pas laisser en passer une, like to never let one go, to never be off your guard, right? Because if you let one go, then you're going to be stuck in these cycles. The theory behind institutional psychotherapy, but also the very practical experiments that I describe here, can provide us with a set of practical tools, some successful, some less so, to erode hierarchy, domination, and forms of authoritarianism in group life, and ultimately to envision different political imaginaries. So I think my book is an attempt to think with institutional psychotherapy, not a hagiography, certainly not a condemnation, but what does it mean to think with it today, to turn it on its head when it's necessary, to confront its blind spots and follow its ethical injunction to always be on the lookout for theoretical dogmatism and political inertia. As such, this is the book is also an endeavor to take seriously the unconscious in politics and to remember the social dimensions of the unconscious, and hopefully to open up other political imaginaries and new sort of forms of common life. So thank you so much. I'll stop sharing right here.